Has planning for the holidays ever seemed more stressful than just winging it, so you skip it? This year, my goal is to be a little more reflective. What I've learned is that by not planning, we're instead relying on our own cognitive flexibility, which is a crucial part of executive functioning that helps with skills like managing time and remembering details. Now, most of us rely pretty heavily on this in our daily lives, but then when you get into the holiday season, you can pretty quickly overload it. So since becoming a mom, I've taken both the planned and unplanned approach to the holidays, and what I have learned is that planning actually lightens my load. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. It helps me set realistic goals and focus on what matters without telling myself that I can do everything and then just burning myself out. So this year, I am bringing you along with me as I go through my planning process, and by the end of this video, I will have a tool that I can share with you to help you plan a fun, doable, and not stressful holiday. So a few years back, I was on my way to pick up a friend from the airport, and I didn't want to be late, so I was ignoring the fact that I was pretty low on fuel. I figured I would just get her and then we'll just stop somewhere on the way home. Now, what I neglected to keep in mind, however, is that I was driving a car with a diesel engine, and for whatever reason where I lived, finding gas stations that actually had diesel was a little bit few and far between. So I got her from the airport and we are on our way back, and we've got maybe 30 miles before we're completely out of fuel, but every single gas station we drove past didn't advertise diesel. So we kept going and we kept going, thinking at some point we're going to see something. So we finally get off at an exit. We're down to our last 5 miles before we're out of fuel, and we finally just hit that zero on the dashboard and we have to pull over, and now we're stranded. And this is prior to GPS and being able to easily look this stuff up online. So we get out of the car and we start walking. We did end up finding a gas station. It also did not have diesel, but from there we were able to call a taxi that drove us around until we found a place with diesel. And eventually we made it home, but well after midnight. And honestly, in the Christmas season, most of us are that poor diesel engine just running on fumes with nowhere to refuel. And I look back, as the car operator, this was avoidable. I could have chosen to stop and refuel at a reliable station that I knew would have diesel, but I chose not to because I didn't want to be late to picking her up from the airport. Basically, it's like I had this expectation of the kind of host that I was going to be, and it did not involve being 5 minutes late to pick my friend up. Now, in retrospect, she absolutely would have preferred me being 5 minutes late to the airport than wandering around in the middle of the night. But I think that thinking of the expectations we have for ourselves comes into play around this time of year. We have a vision that we're trying to stick to, and we will often push ourselves too far until we're completely stranded. So lately, I've been dealing with my temptation to overdo things, like it's just coming out in me again. And going into this season, I really don't want to operate that way. I really want the holidays to be a joyful time, but I have to remind myself that that doesn't have to be expressed through quantity, which I think is kind of our cultural default. But through minimalism, I've found that the opposite is always true. What can be hard, though, is that I get excited about so many things. So the first step in my process is I'm just going to let myself dump all of the ideas that are in my head onto a sheet of paper. This is my brain dump. And in here, I'm going to be putting all of my ideas for the season, as well as all of our obligations, which can include some of our standard obligations, but definitely our seasonal obligations that are going to be piled on top of our regular responsibilities. All right, so if you're not a Christian, you may need context for this next story. Now, in the New Testament, we hear quite a few stories about Jesus interacting with the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were a Jewish sect that believed in strict adherence to the law of Moses. And they had 613 commandments that they had to follow. But what they believed was that this observance ensured righteousness and closeness to God. But their focus on outward behavior and human traditions became a mirage, which led them to miss the deeper message of love, grace, and faith that Jesus came to reveal. In their efforts to be close to God, they ended up chasing a mirage. And I see that happen for so many of us when it comes to the holidays. Like for me, I have this vision of a beautiful season for our family where we're connecting through activities and crafts and baking together and going to events and traveling to see extended family and gifts and decorating and going to see Christmas lights, and it just goes on and on. But all these things become this vision of Christmas that I feel like I have to adhere to. And in being so strict, I lose track of the true meaning. So if I'm being honest with myself, something I've noticed recently is perfectionism impacting my decisions. And I've been sick for a couple of months now. I'm having a little bit of a reprieve, but I keep getting really ill and then getting a little better and then getting sick again. And maybe I'm through it. But what I realized at some point is that I probably wasn't going to get healthy if I didn't prioritize rest. And one of the beautiful aspects of this time of year is that we're entering a season where everything slows down, or at least that's how it is where I live. The natural world starts to go to sleep, and the gesture of winter is this inhale where we start to slow and rest. We seek to be cozy. I have to embrace that and accept that this is a season for the in-breath, especially this year since I've been struggling with staying healthy. So let me explain that idea of the in-breath. It actually comes out of Waldorf. So in Waldorf, they talk a lot about rhythms, and throughout the day, they try to make sure that kids have a balance of in-breath and out-breath. And so, for instance, when you wake up in the morning, it's an exhale. And then you go have breakfast, and it's an inhale. And then you go outside to play, and it's an exhale. And then you come inside to read books with your mom and snuggle, and it's an inhale. And they also recognize it in the seasons. Like they'll talk about how summer is an exhale gesture and winter is an inhale. I think there's a really important insight there. Like we all tend to crave these in-breath gestures this time of year. And then in the holiday season, we have a lot of out-breath activities. And I don't think that's a bad thing, but I think that simultaneously we're all craving the in-breath. I need my in-breaths in order to enjoy my out-breaths. And when I focus entirely on out-breaths, I end up chasing the mirage and losing the meaning. So I have my brain dump. And now I'm going to essentially declutter and organize that list. I call this the mind sweep. So the first thing I'm looking for is trash, stuff that can be put off until after the holidays, stuff that, was rattling around my head. So I had to dump it onto the list. But now that I see it, it's that's kind of dumb and I don't need to do that. Or obligations that I can let go of. Sometimes something feels like an obligation, but once I reflect on it, I can say, actually, that's not something that I really have to do. So then what I'm left with are my non-negotiables, my seasonal priorities, and my would be nice column. So this is the stuff that I'll fit in if I can. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to color code each one of these as in-breath and out-breath. That way, when I'm starting to map them out on a calendar, I can see if I've got that balance that I'm looking for. Recently, our town lost power and we had a ton of traffic lights go out. And at the time, a friend of mine and I were trying to meet out for dinner with our kids and we literally could not get to one another. And so I'm out in the middle of all of this and I had to go through these multi-lane intersections, which are some of the biggest intersections in our town. And so we've just got hundreds of cars kind of slowly trying to make their way through and no one was really sure who had the right of way, which pretty quickly ticked up everybody's anxiety and you could see a lot of indecision in the drivers. Now, if that intersection is your life and every car is an opportunity or option that you have to consider, but there's next to nothing guiding you about who gets to go first, then no wonder so many of us are exhausted and overwhelmed and overtaxed. So this is where minimalism really helps, right? Because it starts to stem the flow of cars that are even coming into the intersection in the first place. But all of this just gets heightened during the holidays. And that's why I like to remind myself of my guiding values, because those are essentially going to become the traffic control during this time of year. So I like to just list out what are the values that I care about for this time of year, and then really focus in on what are the values I'm actually going to prioritize this year. Okay, I think it's time to make a little more coffee, and I'm going to bring you along with me because I want to illustrate an idea to you. Okay, so when I make coffee with a French press, I put the grounds into the carafe and then I pour the hot water over top and I let it steep for about 4 minutes. So at this point, I start to put together the filter and you can see that it has actually 4 different layers. There's this guy, which goes at the bottom. Then there's a little small layer that gets tucked right here on top. Then there's another mesh layer, which is a little bit more open. And then finally this layer that tucks them all together. So I connect the filters to the plunger and I pop it on top of the carafe and I plunge the filter through until all of the grounds are pushed to the bottom and you just have the nice, rich, delicious coffee here on top. So I walk you through all of that because the filters are your values this season and they are going to filter out all of the excess so that you can really enjoy yourself. Now remember, in the mind sweep, we have our non-negotiables and our priorities. Now our non-negotiables are the things that maybe we're not that excited about doing, but we have to do them. and our priorities are the things that we really do want to be doing, and we're putting them at the top of our list. Now we can use our values with evaluating each of these lists. Okay, so now I have my values and they are the filter. So with the non-negotiables, we know we're doing them in some capacity, but can we set some boundaries? So for example, I'm going to keep up with our homeschooling lessons. That's a non-negotiable. But in order to simplify the process, rather than switching to a completely new theme and new unit every single week, which is how our study is constructed, we're actually going to focus on the winter equinox, sticking with that theme for the 3 weeks leading up to the holidays, and then we're going to take 2 weeks off. So we're still learning, but we are eliminating some of the preparation work and the materials and different things that I would need to make time for by simplifying the lesson planning a little bit. So with the non-negotiables, we're doing with them in some capacity, but we are setting some boundaries, looking for ways to simplify, and we are justifying this and giving ourselves some confidence that this is an okay thing to do by looking at our values and saying, do these fall into a value? If they do, maybe we prioritize it a little bit more, but if they're not a value for the season, it's okay to scale back a little bit. Now with priorities, what we're going to do is we're going to relate our priorities to our values, and we're going to rank order them to make sure that the things that are values are ending up at the top of the list. Something that we are really prioritizing this year is family togetherness, and so we are traveling, which is going to be, a big effort on our part. Decorating, probably going to get ranked pretty low because it's really not one of those top 3 values where we're focusing on family togetherness, faith in Advent, and simplicity and slowness. So I'm thinking the things that are really going to end up at the top are Advent and travel. I would say our lantern walk is also, let's call this number 1, this number 2, and our lantern walk is probably priority number 3. Now, the other stuff, I'm not going to kick it off of the priorities list, but it's possible that in this process, you might find something that's in your priorities list that you realize it doesn't align well with your values, and so it gets bumped down. And so this is the framework and filter that I'm using in order to just give myself a little bit more clarity about what the priorities are for the season and what I can let go of. So when I think about all of the things that parents do in order to make the holidays joyful and magical for their families, it reminds me a lot of how gardeners are when they're tending to baby plants. Like, they see so much potential in it and they want to cultivate it. But I think some of us parents could take a lesson from the gardeners who know that each plant requires care and attention, but also space. We all know that if you have too many plants crammed in next to each other, they won't thrive. And I've found this to be true of the holiday season. When I pack it with too much stuff in an effort to make it magical, the result is the opposite. It's a season that's rootless and just stripped of life. And I don't think any of us want that. I want to savor the things we make a priority and just let the rest of it go. So some of my Christmas dreams died in this planning process, but the steps that I've taken are about creating that space and giving myself a solid foundation from which to confidently protect that space, because there are going to be invitations or social pressures that come from various directions that are going to challenge the priorities and the foundation that I've set for myself. But I know that I need the in-breaths this season as well as the out-breaths. And it's from this foundation where we can start to do some of the more practical aspects of planning, like setting a budget, picking out gifts, scheduling activities and events. But to help you with that stuff, which is a lot more straightforward, I've put together some easy to follow exercises that you can just fly through to get yourself completely set for this year. So let me give you an example from the gift planner. So in here, I've got it organized by different types of people. And down here in my friends and extended family section, I am going to be plugging in the few names of our friends that we're going to be giving gifts to. And this year, I'm going to be getting them all hand-painted ornaments. So my sister is a painter and she does ornaments every single year, and they're all beautiful and each one is unique. So it feels like a nice kind of streamlined way to do gift giving for a group of people, but also something that's a little bit more personal. And if you happen to be looking for that type of gift, I will link to her information. The other thing I've realized is that I had a lot of ideas for this year that I left on the cutting room floor, but they're captured in this guide. So next year, I might be able to consider some of them, and I'll be able to reference this to do that. Well, I hope that this video and the planner are a blessing to some of you. Feel free to pass it along, share it with friends and family. I know that the next thing I'm going to be working on is decluttering this house. So if you're planning to do that too, then check out this video here and subscribe so that you can keep up with future videos on the subject. And until next time, bye.